So today we will be going through Understanding the IEP, a practical guide for parents, and we will also be leaving some time for questions at the end of our presentation. Right now, as we get started, we also do want to share that at LearnUp, we have released our series of decodable books, and these are titled Stories of the Looking Glass. We have a variety of book combinations available for sale on ebooks right now, and we will post that link in the chat as well. Right. So here is our information. We'll be sharing our social media links in the chat. Please feel free to connect with us for more resources in the future for families and for educators. All right, so today I am excited to introduce Scott Rudolph. Scott is a special education advocate and founder of Rudolph Advocacy Works. He supports families across the Bay Area and beyond, and he brings a unique systems level perspective from his experience as a former special education teacher and work as an assistant principal and district level manager in special education. So today, Scott works directly with families in active IEP cases, helping them to navigate complex school systems, strengthen students' programs, and ensure services are implemented with fidelity. Scott is known for his practical, parent-friendly approach, breaking down complex processes into clear, actionable strategies. His work focuses not only on what the IEP says, but on whether it is truly working for the student in the classroom. All right, so I am going to hand it over to you now, Scott. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So welcome everybody. My big kind of I guess like Tara said is my big context and focus is kind of implementation at the ground level and making sure these IEPs are digestible for parents and that it's a team collaboration to best support our kiddos in special education. All right. So tonight's goals overarching are really to get into the IEP, see how it works, see how it connects. Also, really kind of understand the roles involved in this collaborative nature of an IEP team. How we can prepare as parents or educational rights holders for the children that we're supporting. Look at some of these potential red flags or warnings that might pop up in some of these meetings. How to equip you to better advocate and ask good questions at these meetings, and then essentially just leave you feeling more confident to advocate for your children at these meetings. So before we start, maybe you can just put in the chat box to kind of whirl around really quick, but maybe give a thumbs up or a yes, that's me if your child already has an IEP. All right, few of us. And then maybe give a thumbs up if you're in the evaluation process, whether that be the initial evaluation process or a triennial reevaluation that's conducted for your child that already has an IEP. Well, I see some of the same thumbs. Awesome. Cool. Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Melanie. And then another thumbs up for, maybe you're at the beginning phases and you're wondering if your child even qualifies or if an IEP or special education is appropriate for your child. Okay. And then this one I always like, but raise your hand or give a thumbs up if you've ever left an IEP meeting feeling a little bit more confused than when you walked in. I'll give a thumbs up for that too. Even in my experience, yeah, definitely. As an advocate, I'm right there with you at times too. Absolutely. All right. Thanks. Cool. All right. Just to expand a little bit on my story, I was a former special education teacher, taught the resource support program, the RSP, the SDC special day class, mild to moderate and moderate to severe. Back then, it was called the cross categorical and the categorical programs. I even taught the autism resource program. That's a new one that's unique to a lot of districts, but it's just a smaller caseload of super high functioning students on the spectrum. A lot of my kids had like AP classes they were taking and just dealt with some meltdowns and some, social pragmatic concerns. But After that, I moved into administration. I was an assistant principal of curriculum instruction at a big comprehensive high school, building the master schedule, working with staff and professional development. Then I moved into the principal role. After that, I moved laterally, I guess, if you will, to a neighboring school district and was the manager of special education, overseeing special ed implementation at 5 school sites. But ultimately, a large part of my role there was working with the district attorney and making sure that our district was you know doing things the right way, and making sure that we were staying in compliance. So it wasn't the most fulfilling role for me. I liked being around the students and the families, and it just felt like nobody was very happy to see me when I was either on campus or at these IEP meetings, because usually they were in situations where the IEP had headed in a direction where they needed a little bit more support at that meeting from a district lens. But now I'm really doing what I enjoy, and I'm working as a advocate full time, supporting families across California. And I'm doing some training and professional development opportunities for organizations and districts to implement inclusive practices at their school sites. And in addition to that, is really teaching these teams and educators how to understand the IEP, but then also look at the implementation side of things at a ground level and making sure that it's appropriate and working for the students as well. So, a couple kind of misconceptions I think is that I come about often. This is not just from my experience, working with a bunch of different IEP teams and different stakeholders at these meetings. But an IEP isn't always about getting everything that your child needs. And I think that this is a cold hard reality of how the law is interpreted by the school districts. Is we've most of us have heard the acronym FAPE, Free Appropriate Public Ed. But ultimately, FAPE, there's a word in that I really want to underscore, and that's appropriate. And I think that that's a little bit of a challenge as parents, because we really would like to replace that appropriate with best, right? Is free best public education. But the law doesn't dictate that. The law dictates that the district needs to offer appropriate education given the unique learning needs and or profile of the students. And it's important to note that in oftentimes these schools are doing what they have to do legally to make sure that they're keeping things compliant, and they're appropriately modeling for these audits that they're under, that you know they're meeting the requirements of faith. But then when you look at these classrooms and get a little bit closer, and you get that magnifying glass out behind the data that's posted on the California dashboards, is it's not always the best, and there's always room for improvement. And that's really where parents and advocates and some of these stakeholders that are pulling for the best interest of the students really need to speak up and understand the IEP, the assessment data, and try to maximize that approach to get those best outcomes for our kids, and not just appropriate. I just wanted to highlight that. So IDEA and plain English here is this is just kind of the flow, if you will, of an IEP. And many of us have gone through this process. Maybe we're right in the middle of it. I work with students that are TK preschool families that have TK preschoolers all the way up to high school, 12th grade, post-secondary, transitioning. And ultimately, this is the flow where you need to have an evaluation. And we see oftentimes, and I'll allude to this a little bit later, but many families have a 504 plan, and they got their outside diagnostic from their healthcare professional or pediatrics. And they have a distinguishing document that says my child has ADHD. And we think that the school district will take that and say, okay, we don't really have to do our evaluation here. We're going to just kind of take this outside report and implement. That's not how it works in the public school system, at least in California specifically. Is you really need to go off of the district's data and analysis, and they need to conduct their own report that then identifies the disability and essentially those areas of need. If you've ever gotten down in the IEP and looked at most documents have it on page 2, the eligibility page, and it shows at the very bottom those check boxes where it says areas of need. Those aren't just randomly, scattered in there, or they shouldn't be. Ultimately, those are driven by the assessment data. And so those don't change outside of an assessment year window. And so ultimately those identified areas of disability drive the goals. And I think that's one kind of underlying theme that I want to highlight is that the needs of a student really drive the services and the goals of their IEP. Um, the eligibility piece is, what my child qualifies for special education related services and supports, what they qualify under. It could be a range of distinguishing disabilities. I mean, many of us I've seen, have autism as primary eligibility, and then maybe a secondary eligibility of speech and language impairment. I've seen, many IEPs I work with are specific learning disability where there's a gap between the data and then essentially, what the student's able to achieve output wise with regard to what might be happening in their brain and what they're actually able to conceptualize and understand. But one kind of tricky one that really comes up often that many districts will use toward the student's advantage is other health impairment, and it's one of those eligibility criteria that kind of houses as an umbrella different disabilities related to physical um, uh, disabilities, such as ADHD would qualify under OHI, um, and some of these health impairments too can qualify under OHI, where there needs to be goals and services to support that gap. But ultimately, it doesn't quite matter with regard to receiving supports and services, what eligibility criteria you fall under. If you qualify for special education under one of those distinguishing eligibilities, then, essentially you're through the door and you have an IEP, and now we can advocate toward what it is that your child needs. Um, so I just wanted to highlight that. And, that eligibility in an assessment year, it can change and be updated. I've seen speech language impairment and autism be flipped primary and secondary eligibility as that student, gains, more progress in the area of pragmatic language or gains more progress in articulation. And then speech isn't as big of an area of concern where that student might have been nonverbal 3 years ago, but they still qualify under autism and their IEP is not going away. But we do see, eligibility change and flip depending on the assessment window and gains in progress. Essentially, that eligibility drives the IEP, like I shared, the services, supports, accommodations, potentially those modifications of curriculum. Um, and that's where we really get into that offer of FAPE or those related services that the district's going to offer based off of the assessment data and that eligibility that's determined. Ultimately, that leads to a monitoring of progress, right? We have that IEP held, that annual IEP, and then, those goals are established. But we do oftentimes see that those goals, maybe our child passes up those goals like right away, second month or first quarter. You get that goal progress update from the district in the snail mail or via email, and it says, oh, they met these 3 goals. Well, that's great. Then that means we need to reestablish and revisit a baseline for those goals and implement a goal that's, stretching out that goalpost a little further and increasing the rigor in order to gain independence or promote growth in those areas of need. But ultimately, as many of you know, because you've been in this process, many of you, is you do have that IEP reviewed annually, and you have the right to request an IEP potentially up to every 30 days to review and monitor progress. But like we shared before, that triennial reevaluation happens every 3 years, sometimes sooner, depending on the need. And, if we're looking at a change of placement or a change in services, reduction in services, that might be an appropriate time to request a bumped up triennial reevaluation to get that fresh data set in order to drive the placement. I'm spending a lot of time on this slide here because this is crucially important to understand this piece related to the reevaluation process. when it comes to our students that are younger in preschool and TK, oftentimes they get assessed in that first year. That's their initial eligibility year, right? They qualify for an IEP at, let's say, 3.5 years old. And then, 3 years after that, they're six and a half going into, first grade. And that's now looking at placement is increasingly difficult. It's challenging to place that kid in the appropriate environment because we're sitting on, essentially a stale set of data, and that student has grown leaps and bounds like all of our kids do in 3 years. But that window of time at the TK and the younger kiddo level, a lot changes there. And I just want to kind of underscore that might be appropriate time to bump up a triennial reevaluation to revisit placement services and offer a fate. So, a couple stakeholders on the IT team. It's not always limited to this, but we do have parents. Hopefully, all of our parents will go there. Sometimes both. Sometimes it's a grandparent as well. Anybody that's aware of the student's profile and you know works with them often at home is important to have there, in my opinion. Sometimes we have a student there at the appropriate age, and sometimes they're just there for present levels and maybe updates from the teachers. We always need a general education teacher there. Even if our kiddo is in the special day class, it is very important, even in the special day classes where we don't have much general education contact outside of the lunchtime and recess. We want a general education teacher there so that we can ask, what is expected at grade level? How can we fade in a little bit more to the general education last year? We need that gen ed input. Oftentimes, we do see the districts and the school teams unfortunately try to excuse the general education teacher for, I'll be honest with you, I've worked at a school in the district, and, as a teacher and admin is, it might be too hard to nail down a date because, the gen ed teacher has something else that they need to do department wise. And, it just doesn't work out. Well, that's not always in our best interest to excuse that gen ed teacher. And if we do excuse that gen ed teacher, I don't know why I'm picking on the gen ed teacher here. We love our gen ed teachers, but if we do excuse a team member, the district is required, even if it's for part of the meeting, the last, 15 minutes, if we're being clear on process and procedure, they do need to fill out a team member excusal form that's signed by an administrator and the parent saying, yeah, we're okay with that, to excuse that gen ed teacher or that service provider because they had an appointment, at 3:30 that day. That it's something that the district needs to do, and we need to have a paper trail that they exited early and that we okayed that. Special education teacher or an ed specialist should be at that meeting. Usually that's your case manager in a non-speech only IEP. That's usually your case manager as a special ed teacher. There should be an admin or an LEA designee. That LEA designee can be a principal, an assistant principal. It can also be a district administrator, like a program specialist, a program coordinator, a director of special education. It cannot be the district attorney. If you've ever had to go to a legal meeting, the district attorney cannot serve as the LEA or the administrator of record. They can attend the meeting, but they can't serve in that capacity. Oftentimes, too, in some of the districts I work at, I do see a school psychologist as the admin designee. That is fine as long as that psychologist or that person that's serving as the admin designee, the LEA, is not also serving as a psychologist at that meeting. We cannot have a school psychologist reporting a triennial reevaluation saying, oh, yeah, and I'm also the LEA designee that can field these questions related to my role as a stakeholder at this meeting. It's inappropriate. We're not okay with that. We would not have a meeting if that were the case. Obviously, the related service providers, if it's a meeting that we're talking about general education access and we feel like, well, the occupational therapist might not have to be there. What if sensory needs come up? What if a sensory diet or checklist come up? We do want that service provider there to be able to touch on that, even if they aren't the main focus of that meeting. Um, Outside professionals like an advocate. Some people invite other organizations like SARC, ABA specialists to kind of come and either share input. That happens often, but it's up to the parents' decision and discretion to do that. So we kind of alluded to this before, but those present levels or that kind of snapshot of who the child is, how they learn, what are their areas of need, what are the parent concerns, right? That drives how we author our goals and the baseline data behind those goals. And we'll get into goals in a moment. Um, but those goals should be tied to the services we're receiving. If we have a bunch of reading goals, let's say we have a couple reading goals surrounding comprehension and decoding, right? But there's nothing in the student's IEP related to services that addresses that goal area of reading. That's an inappropriate IEP, and that's an inappropriate offer of faith or service provision. Because the question inherently is, well, when the heck are they going to work on those reading goals if they're in the gen ed doing kind of grade level content, but they're reading at a second grade level? How are we supposed to make sense out of them getting not just the proper supports, but even the assessing of those goals and the progress monitoring? It's inappropriate. That needs to be tied to the services. I'm not saying that means that they have a specialized academic reading class necessarily, but there should be some level of maybe guided studies or a support class, some pull out or push in to the IEP that's built in to address those areas of need that are essentially captured in those goals. Those services essentially boil down to the placement. What is the most appropriate environment to place this student in to be able to receive said services and goals and supports, right? If these services are very restrictive in the sense of quite a few minutes of specialized academic instruction where they have intense reading goals and they have some clear cut math calculation goals that cannot be typically supported in the gen ed, and they would need a level of pull out to that's factored into the placement decision of, okay, do we break this into a couple special education classes on the student schedule or time within their bell schedule throughout the day if it's elementary school students. But we see this ultimately prevalent in the secondary education with middle school and high school when you're actually looking at a 6 period, 7 period schedule and saying, okay, where are we going to fit this in? And what are we replacing with this elective class per se to get this student the services and supports they need to address those areas of need and goal? So present levels are very important. In the early days of being a special education teacher, I almost just thought of this as like the progress report, right? I didn't quite understand this section to the extent, but this is essentially now as a former special education teacher, this is some good hearty information, some meat and potatoes when I'm getting into the student's IEP. I should be able to read the present level section of this IEP and get a very firm understanding of how this student presents, right? It's present as in the capturing of this moment where they're at right now, but this is how the student presents in the classroom, right? During transitions, during recess, socially, right? Where are they at academically? I don't love it, and this happens often. We do ask districts to kind of pare this down. I don't love it when the academic section or pre-academic functioning section of the present levels is just littered with the psychologist report that they just kind of copy and pasted in there, or the ed specialist academic report where it's like, here, it's all these standard scores in there. That to me is not using that section of the IEP beneficially. That's where I like to break down how this child learns. I should be able to receive this IEP as a new teacher of record and be like, oh, that's Jimmy. Okay, now I'm starting to understand what to say, what not to say, what type of interaction the student likes, and so forth. So ultimately, one of the big pieces that I really want to highlight about the present level section, though, is the parent concerns. And I know that that's not always the most fun part to highlight at these meetings. Like, do you have any concerns? And you feel like put on the spot, right? Those parent concerns could also be documented in an email prior or post and say, hey, we want this document in the parent concerns. I work very closely with the trusted attorney down in Southern California, and we meet monthly to talk about, how these pieces interrelate and what leads to disputes or filing for due process. And she's taught me really that the district has an obligation to seek to resolve the parent concerns category of the IEP. The district needs to be actively, for lack of a better term, pumping their arms, working toward resolving whatever that parent's concern is related to the student's progress, right? So if there is a parent concern surrounding general education support for my child when they're, in the general education outside of the special day class, if that's a parent concern, what those supports are, the district needs to be actively seeking to resolve that said concern and show that they're doing that. Otherwise, there could be a failure to implement the IEP as written, and a failure to address, needs and parent collaboration is a huge strain on some of these districts when they're seeking um, support for these cases to try to resolve them after it's, we see problems arise from these documents and in these meetings and lack of resolution, if you will. So I want to get into like a little vague example though of what a goal should not look like and shouldn't look like. And I kept it very skinny for a purpose here just to kind of show you. But hopefully we don't see a goal like the left side here where it's very vague and unmeasurable. Johnny struggles with reading as the present level, right? Well, thanks, right? We knew that. That's partially why we're here, and we have the reading intervention services, if you will, right? But ultimately, we need to see how he struggles. Show us, right? In the data, where are we at right now? Well, Johnny currently reads 47 correct words per minute on grade level text with 81% accuracy. Now we have some information. And then give me a little bit more about what exactly he does, struggle with, right? That helps me as not just the teacher, but the parent to understand where these gaps are, and then even work with outside organizations like LearnUp to be able to understand, where the gap is. Let's give them something to actually tangibly work on. That he struggles with decoding multisyllabic words, right? Vowel teams, reading fluency. Give me some real hardy information as far as where this student is struggling so that I can pick up when this kiddo might come to our school mid-year, right? They might switch classes or switch schools because of a move, and we want to be able to receive them the right way. But honestly, it goes without saying, without this measurable data, it's really impossible for a new IEP team or a current IEP team or the general education teacher to be able to implement this. So we've all heard of the SMART goal. Well, I'm coining the new one, the SMOKE goal. I like this acronym though because it's kind of a little bit more aligned to what we like to see in IEPs. Yes, the goals have to be specific, right? We can't be vague, ambiguous here. They also have to be measurable. We have to have a data point, data. When we're looking at growth in any kind of academic sense or even social emotional goals, right? It has to be measurable. It's got to be observable. This has to be like we said, tied to the student's placement, tied to their services that they're receiving, that we'll be able to actually see them working on this goal, see where they need to progress in and so forth. It's got to be data driven, right? This can't just be pulled out of thin air. That's not how the goals work. They have to be driven off of standardized assessment tools that the district has conducted to be able to establish a clear-cut baseline. That's where we start, right? And if we get through, part of the year and that goal is inappropriate, maybe it's too lofty. I gave the example that it's, too simple of a goal and we surpass that in 2 months. This goal should be right on cue with that student's level to stretch out that goalpost and rigor to essentially promote least restrictive environment over time. That's the game right there. Is essentially I want this student in the least restrictive environment, least restrictive placement, least restrictive setting or services and supports to be able to continue to progress toward independence and mastery of that concept or area of need. It's got to be time limited. This cannot be something that's stretched out over a 3-year plan. One thing that I love about some of our more hands-on programs like the special day classes in the moderate severe settings or the categorical classes, a lot of these goals are at the county programs, the much more restrictive environments. They have benchmarks to their goals. We kind of get away with that in the secondary, middle school, high school level, where it's just like, hey, this is the goal that we're going for over the course of the year. And, oh, this is where we're at now during the progress update window. But the benchmarks are really nice because it shows you like what we're going to tackle by this time right? And that gives us a good understanding if we need to revisit that goal. So maybe that's something you unpack at your next meeting too, is, maybe it's not even clearly identified what those benchmarks are, but you discuss that, right? Well, what does that look like? Can you explain to me, IEP team, where we'll most likely be at in 2 months or in a semester? I want to know. That'll help me, collaborate and support at home. So weak goal versus a good goal, right? Like we talked about, vague, unmeasurable. We got to be smote. We got to be smote here. The vague, unmeasurable would look kind of like Johnny will improve his reading level and sound words out. Yes, we want that, but how? What's our method? How do we know if we've arrived? Right? If you've worked in education, you got to have a clear understanding of like, yes, we did it. We can move on, or no, we need to revisit this. But a better actionable goal item would be: given a fifth grade passage, Johnny will increase oral reading fluency from 47 to 90 correct words per minute with at least 95% accuracy across 3 consecutive probes. I really like the back half of that goal. And, I got to be honest with you, as a former special education teacher, a lot of the times they just throw in, 2 out of 3, measurable observations or trials, right? That, that's fine. We want trials, but it's got to be strategic and it has to make sense why we're throwing that many trials in that, right? Yes, we don't want to look at something in silos, but there are times where some of these goal annotations, when you're looking at 8 out of 10 observations for a particular task, that might not be appropriate either if we've already moved on from that concept. So we want to make it organic to the sense where it's fitting into the curriculum, but also, stretched out enough that it's you know progressible for that student. And that's not your job as the parent, or even the advocate at times, to be the one to establish the verbiage of this goal. But you definitely have a say, right? They're supposed to provide you with that baseline data and the starting point, and then it should be a team discussion surrounding where we want that goal to end up, and the kind of the progress timeline for these actionable items. So services, I think that this is key to kind of really understand outside of the goals, right? Is ultimately when we have a goal and a student's goal areas, like if we get an IEP, and this is a big, role that I had at the district office. It was very challenging. This is a very challenging position to put in, but I'd get the ping in my inbox saying that we have a new student. I'd get this new IEP, could be out of district, out of state. I look at the goals in the present levels, right? And the previous services, but sometimes the services are different, from Texas than they would be to California, and how they do this resource model might be totally different in Alabama than it is here in California or Nevada. And so ultimately I had to look at those present levels and the goals, and make a determining, interim offer to the family saying, this is where we think the most appropriate placement is. And yeah, I'd have to tap into a school psychologist sometime. And how are you interpreting this kind of deal? But ultimately, you'd be looking at that and trying to see what model or placement or classroom or structure or environment can support the teaching or the learning of these goals, you know this program that's maybe not grade level, right? Maybe the student's reading significantly below grade level, but then their math concepts are through the roof, and they're killing it, right? And so getting creative with regard to the service provision, what time of the day, what class are they getting pulled out from that gen ed class, and are they getting pushed into that class? How many minutes will it take to support this over time? And oftentimes we see that interim offer, not work great. And then we revisit that at the 30-day IEP when we're sitting down and seeing, how is implementation going? Do we need to revise? So, keeping that lens kind of keen to, yes, we want our students in the least restrictive environment. But again, I would say we want them in the appropriate environment, given not just their unique learning needs, but also the services that have been offered to you by the district. we talked about this just a second ago, but placement really is following that need, right? One thing that is a huge concept that's coming up very often for a few of the families I work with is, I have students that are primarily in the general education receiving their supports, and then I have students that are primarily in the special education, the special day class receiving their supports, and then we really look at something that districts include this at the very top of the related services page for most depending on Cyrus or SACE, whatever platform they're using, but they'll say something along the lines of full continuum considered, the least restrictive environment to be the gen ed or the special day class, right? And the big key term there, sometimes you'll see different boxes checked at the top that say like, special education class was considered, related services was considered, general education, that says all the things that were considered. But then when you look at that and you look at the notes of your IEP and you reflect that maybe you recorded the IEP meeting, you look at that and you say, wait a minute, we didn't discuss that, right? That those considerations matter when you're determining the least restrictive environment. But we need to talk about it. We need to have a team discussion surrounding, and this is kind of the key concept that I really try to walk many of the families I work with through, and for these trainings too, is the harmful effects. And this is kind of the litmus test or the reality check here. And sometimes you are the best advocate as the parent, understanding both sides of the harmful effect. Let's just give an example of a student that, maybe is kind of in between. Maybe they're a little bit too high for the special day class, for the full day. But then, man, general education would be a stretch. If they were in the gen ed full time with not a lot of like support, maybe like one para in there for like 6 other students with IEPs, and maybe you're like, I don't know if that's enough. I'm not sure. I'm kind of right in the middle. Looking at the harmful effects, would it? And the inherent question is, would it be more harmful for my student, given this context, to be in the special day class? And one thing I hear is be around some of those behaviors. Man, they'll model it. If they see a student hitting, then they'll start hitting at home. If they blurt out, then now they're doing that and they're mirroring some of these behaviors. Or maybe it's a sense where it's like, well, now that there's less speech involved in that class, they're not progressing in their expressive communication, right, as much as they used to be. And maybe those are the harmful effects that you're weighing out against. Well, if they're in the general education class, they could be feeling a little bit overwhelmed and maybe a little bit lost. And maybe the social piece, maybe they stem to an extent where it's impacting their social kind of grasp and relationship building. Maybe it frustrates them to the point where now we see different behaviors, or for some of my students, we've seen self-injurious behaviors due to frustration. And now you're weighing out harmful effects of either, right? And oftentimes we don't see the school districts do an outstanding job of this. We see oftentimes a very average job of consideration of harmful effects when determining least restrictive environment. But that's when you really have to put your parent hat on and your advocate hat on and really kind of look at, honestly, what would be more harmful in this kind of move, either which way, or staying here or moving here, and really evaluating that and discussing it with the teams. Progress monitoring. I think a good question inherently ask is, how will we know if it's working, or how will we know if it's not working? But we want to think of the positive, right? And you could ask that at a meeting, but essentially, monitoring progress ensures that the student's program is delivering those results. If progress is not being measured and minimal progress made on those goal progress updates or the anecdotes, right? We look at that, and that's cost to maybe meet for an emergency IEP or a 30-day IEP and discuss, reauthoring those baselines or reauthoring those goals to be more appropriate for our kiddo. So we look at, and this is kind of the district initiative that we're under at the district I used to work at, is looking at multiple tiered systems of support, the MTSS model, right? And I like to think of that as a funnel, right? It's and I'll be cold hard reality of it too with funding. It is a lot cheaper to fund the seat of a general education student, right? It's cheaper for a district. It's less expensive to be able to support uh, the generalized population with little things, right? Like little reading activities or even minor reading intervention, small groups within the class. Not bad things by any means, and appropriate for many students, but that is very cost effective for a district or a school to be able to capture a large group of these funneled students to be able to kind of get them back at grade level, right? A little bit further down the funnel, we're looking at like, an SST meeting or, these parent teacher conferences, maybe a 504 plan to support the student's unique needs. And then, a more restricted placement like an IEP with services and supports. Yeah, there's some funding tied to that. And so ultimately we do see, the districts try to push back and field these concerns. Maybe a parent comes in with a very clear request for special education assessment, and the team says, "Well, hold on, let's go through the MTSS model, the SST kind of funnel. Let's try this first." Not a bad idea, but sometimes it's okay to skip steps here as a family or stakeholders on the student side of the table, is to really kind of look at, we've tried that, right? We've been working in this area. We've been doing reading intervention class now for 2 years. We're still struggling to make progress in this area, and this is where we need to kind of escalate. So little shout to dyslexia, but I just want to highlight, certain students that have dyslexia does not necessarily mean that they're going to qualify for an IEP, but it could, right? It could be a distinguishing factor that plays into the assessment data that would indicate, yes, we have some reading challenges that raise to the need where the student qualifies for specific learning disability, and we could write goals in this area. But ultimately, some of the challenges of dyslexia are phonology, right? Where we look at recognizing and manipulating sounds. Maybe applying letter sounds are very challenging. Spelling could be kind of an area of concern as well. But ultimately, we do see fluency, strongly impacted when it comes to, hearing, reading smoothly, right? And that's definitely going to impact our comprehension when it's hard for us to read smoothly. So it's one thing to kind of keep an eye on some of those challenges related to dyslexia and how they might impact your child at school if that's something they're struggling with. Um, Dyslexia it's not an intelligence issue. It does not mean that our student does not have the capability to learn. It's embedded essentially within the brain pathway, where it's impacting like how these things are being processed, not necessarily how capable my brain is of thinking, if that makes sense. But we do see you know that kind of oftentimes like a strength in some of these other areas related to spatial awareness or analysis and being able to like comprehend things in a different way or critically think. So it's just interesting as we see some of these breakdowns with dyslexia. Big family takeaway I'll leave you with though with related to dyslexia is with structured instruction, targeted intervention, and proper support, there are ways to build strong literacy skills and really full. I think the big thing is being able to access that grade level content or learning, even if we do have dyslexia that we're struggling with. One thing that I just want to highlight briefly with dyslexia and the IEP is dyslexia is not a qualifying area of eligibility. If we have dyslexia, like I shared, that doesn't mean that we qualify. However, we do see dyslexia being, implemented as an area of need in the present level section of the IEP. We can see dyslexia being addressed in annual goals like phonemic awareness, decoding. It's areas that we could, integrate addressing that need. But oftentimes districts will say we don't assess for dyslexia. Well, we can look at the data and tomato. We'll get down to the bottom of this and be able to address this student where their needs are that are related to this dyslexia problem that we're seeing. And then we also could see it addressed with specialized academic instruction, right? Where they're working on reading goals and working on pull-out sessions sometimes with reading intervention that is designated in the IEP. Some of those supports too that we see often is text-to-speech books, speech-to-text writing. That's a very common one I've seen in secondary too, with a lot more writing. That could be an accommodation there to address dyslexia as well. So with the structured literacy, honestly, this is why, I just quick shout out to LearnUp. This is why, organizations like LearnUp exist and be able to support students that struggle with some of these literacy, pieces, because ultimately it does take a village to be able to support our students and get them to growth and capacity. I want to kind of get through the next couple slides so that I can answer some of these questions. But last couple slides here is that I really just want to make sure that you're equipped at these meetings to, bring any kind of outside questions that you have, bring a notebook, bring any data that you have, outside reports so you can cross-reference it. But just really kind of come in with that calm mindset that you could effectively advocate for your student. Just a couple canned questions for you to ask. I know this is going to be recorded, but how are these goals selected? How will progress be monitored? What happens if the progress stalls? Another one would be, how did we arrive at this decision, or what other factors were considered? That's a very strong one. Some red flags to look at is, that copy and paste button related to the goals, right? It shouldn't just be like another grade level promoted. We should see some meaningful adaptation to these goals. Also, staying keen to that data and it being tied to these goals and services is important too. Well, really, the last thing is I just want to let some pressure off of you. You don't have to be the expert, right? You just have to know your child and be able to care and support and listen and learn and be able to advocate for them, how you know how to already as a parent. Stay calm at these meetings. Try to seek out clarity, and then really making those connections with regard to focusing on solution and kind of getting the best outcomes out of these meetings that we can. There are different valves that we could go down if we have to. But ultimately, it's really trying to capture that in the IEP process. And if we can't, then we need that prior written notice and clear documentation from the district indicating what their refusal is or their declining of your request. And then there are different valves like alternative dispute resolution that doesn't require an attorney, but oftentimes the SELPA or the governing umbrella will put in a judge to your case to be able to help sort some of these things out appropriately. And then obviously there are the legal pathways surrounding, filing for due process with an attorney, filing a CDE state level complaint is what it is in California, or even just, seeking out attorney or advocacy support to better understand how to move forward with your situation for, resolution's sake. I'm going to skip the case study for now, Tara, just for time's sake. Okay. Just a kind of plethora of things that you could try is really look at the present levels of your student's IEP, look at those goals and make sure they're tied to it. Check out that progress data that you've had over time for the last year. Keep your records organized. Maybe it's starting a Google Drive or, a old file cabinet, but make sure that you have those records accessible for you to be able to review and keep. And then ultimately, call for that meeting if you need it. If you need an expedited meeting, call for it. Just some helpful resources. Again, this is going to be in the slideshow or the recording too. But if you want to snap a picture of that, that's some helpful resources that you could look up or look into to get some better support.